All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are talking all about how to plan your training hikes. And this is specifically relevant for people who may be leading into a big hike, which they know they need to train for. So not so much someone who's just training regularly to kind of keep fit for the trail. You probably don't really need to do this. But this is more for someone who has a big date in mind, whether it's an overseas hike, trek, maybe a big backpacking trip locally, or maybe just your first super long day hike or whatever it may be. And essentially, I want to talk you through a new sort of approach that I've been doing over the last 6 months. It's not too revolutionary, but I think it is pretty significant. Now, if you've heard me talk about this before, usually what I advocate about when it comes to planning your training hike specifically, so you actually getting out on the trail when you're leading into a big trip, is essentially really, really simple. Get out a calendar 2 weeks before you head off on a trip, making sure you're planning a day which is equivalent to your longest day on the trip with your heaviest pack weight, and planning that about 2 weeks before you head off. And then essentially from there, just going backwards in your calendar and just penciling in all the different dates you think you may be able to hike, and then just sort of slowly working backwards from that and making sure there's a nice, slow, steady build with your hiking. Now, that is a great process. It absolutely works. There's one little tweak to this that I would like to sort of talk through today, and something I've been doing with my hikers probably for the last 6 months or so. And I think it is pretty significant. And essentially, when people are going down and sitting down and planning out their hikes, there's a few variables that we often have to consider. There's distance, there's elevation, there's up and down, there's pack weight, and then also, how much time you're actually hiking for. Now, traditionally, there's kind of two different ways that people will usually the way, actually, I should say, that people often plan out their hikes is they're usually looking at distance and elevation. In the sense of okay, I need to get ready for this day where I've got to hike, say, 20 kilometers, and I've got a certain amount of elevation. So they essentially go through their training hikes, making sure they're slowly building up to that distance and slowly building up to that elevation, which works absolutely perfectly fine if you have a clear run of training. However, I am doing something a little bit different these days. And essentially, when I'm looking at my hikers' training hikes, and when I'm planning the sort of months ahead, so the next 3, 4, 5, even 6 months ahead in regards to their training hikes, we'll get the information around how often they want to hike, roughly how much time they want to commit to it, obviously the demands of their particular hike. And essentially what I've been doing, as opposed to programming out distance, so kilometers and mileage, and as opposed to programming out elevation, what I've been programming out is time. So as opposed to me sort of saying, hey, I want you to do a 15-kilometer hike this week, I've been saying I want you to do a 2 to 3 hour hike, or a 3 to 4 hour hike, or a 5 to 6 hour hike, or whatever it may be. And I personally think this is a really, really, really good way of going about things. And I strongly encourage you personally, if you are leading up to a big adventure, to consider this. Because one of the big factors when it comes into training for anything is the body and the mind. It goes through ups and downs. It's very rare that there's a linear process in regards to training, meaning you just get fitter, you feel stronger, you feel great. Week by week by week, you just keep on pushing things. There are so many other factors which affect us. We have periods of bad sleep. We have periods of big stress. We have periods of where we're looking after people and where our time gets affected or whatever it may be. And all of these different things, will show that week after week, our energy will vary. Our motivation will vary. And we may not always just be full firing. And sometimes what I've seen with hikers in this is if they've sat down, they planned out a big plan of training, and they're like, you know what, I'm going to start off slow, then I'm going to increase my mileage, and increase my elevation. That's all well and good if you have a really clean run of training and nothing gets in your way. But the issue is when you do have a week of low energy, say you haven't been sleeping well, say you've gotten a little bit sick, say you've got lots and lots of stress, and that coincides with a week that you plan to do a training hike. And not only that, but you plan to do a hike, which is quite difficult. It's going to be challenging. That gets people into trouble. And either they'll be like, you know what, I've just had a tough week, I'm not going to do the hike, which is usually fine, but if you've got a pressing date, that can often be a bit tricky. Or people will go out and do this really challenging thing, but they'll just be so low energy, they'll have a terrible time. And the last thing we really want with our training for hiking is taking away from the pleasure of the trail and taking away from the fun of the trail. So that's in the context of like planning out your distance. There'll be some weeks where you have big weeks, some weeks where you'll be a bit flatter, whatever it may be. But essentially what I've been doing lately is I've been programming out time instead. So instead of saying X kilometers, X mileage, I've been saying doing X hours. And I like this because essentially it gives the hiker and it gives you the ability to kind of regulate how you're feeling week to week. And essentially what it does is like, what I always tell my hikers is if I've sort of asked you to do, say, a 3 to 4 hour hike on one weekend, but you get to the weekend and you're like, you know what, I've had a tough week. I haven't been sleeping well. I'm not feeling great. I'm a bit low energy. I say, look, go out and do a hike because we do want to fit in, some hiking with this. But what I'd like you to do is choose a hike which fits within that time period, that 3 to 4 hours, but it's quite flat. It's quite gentle. It's quite easy. And you basically just cruise along, just accumulate that time. And for us in that situation, that is perfectly acceptable for a training effect because you still get a good accumulation of lower intensity exercise. You still do get a good accumulation of walking. But it sort of fits around how you're feeling. Now, alternatively, I tell my hikers, I'm like, look, if you get to this weekend and you're like, you know what, I'm actually full of energy. I'm really feeling good this week. I really want to push things. And then I ask them to choose a hike, which again fits within this time period that I've recommended, but has a lot more up and down, has a lot more elevations, much more challenging terrain. And essentially this kind of gives them the ability to kind of auto-regulate around how they're feeling week to week. So we can kind of make sure they're still progressing, kind of make sure they're still getting stimulus for training, but it doesn't just run them into the ground. And then if we're looking at like, say, let's, for example, a 6-week training plan in regards to this, it could sort of look like, okay, week 1, we do a 2 to 3 hour hike. Week 2, we do a 3 to 4 hour hike. Week 3, we do a 4 to 5 hour hike. And then week 5, we go back down to 2 to 3 hours, but we increase the pack weight. Then 3 to 4 hours, but with that heavier pack weight. Then 4 to 5 hours with that heavier pack weight. And that in itself, we can see that nice, solid progression, that nice, solid, moving forwards. But it doesn't really matter for me whether they're doing super hard hikes or whether they're doing relatively gentle hikes, because we're still going to guarantee a nice progression. And then when you're looking at the sort of long-term planning of this, essentially all you have to do is when you're looking at that calendar, when you're planning things out, is you just need to figure out what the longest day you're going to be doing. And if your trip has given you like kilometers or mileage or elevation, then essentially you just need to convert that to roughly how long it's going to take. So if it's like, a 5-hour day, if it's an 8-hour day, if it's a 12-hour day, whatever it may be, and essentially you just want to make sure that you're building up to that. And if you don't end up hitting the elevation targets, but you still get to that equivalent hour distance, that actually works pretty well because your body's used to moving for that amount of time. And it may not be perfect, but it works pretty well. And I really do think this is kind of a good way of going about planning your hiking training, particularly if you've got a big trip coming up, and particularly if you do have a lot going on in your life. Sometimes your energy's up, sometimes your energy's down. And I think this is a really good way of planning things out. So my advice to you, if you are leading into a big trip, or if you've got one coming up, or you just like planning out your training hikes, whatever it may be, my advice to you is maybe start trying this out, just seeing how it goes. Just try planning out your hours worth of hiking. And then just find hikes which kind of fit within those time periods, as opposed to planning distance and elevation. And personally, I think it can be really, really effective. Now, obviously, there are some people who probably listen to this and like, okay, Rowan, this kind of sounds cool, but, I've got a big elevation hike coming up and I'm worried about that elevation. So I like to be a bit more precise and I like to really, really make sure I'm hitting these numbers. And if that's you, that's fine. That's not a problem. Like you do you, whatever you prefer. But I'm just floating this idea because I've been using it for probably the last 6 months with my hikers and I think it's been working really, really well. And I think it's taken a lot of pressure and a lot of just down spots away from my hikers in regards to their time on the trail and just give them a bit more flexibility in regards to what's going on week by week. So I think it can be pretty cool. So my advice, give it a whirl, give it a try. If you're planning things out, see how it goes and you might be surprised just how much you like it. So that's all I've really got to say on this subject today. I hope that all makes sense. I hope you got a little bit out of it. Now, as I always sort of say, well, I haven't probably said on this podcast for a while, but if you're listening to this and you're like, boom, Rowan, I like what you're saying. I like your ideas around training. I like the idea, like concept of all this. But in all honesty, planning this all out, figuring this all out for me, myself, and trying to get myself ready for these trips, it is a little bit overwhelming and I do want a little bit of help. If you do want a bit of extra help with your training for hiking, we do offer online personal training for hiking through Summit Strength. That's what we do all day, every day. We are very, very good at it. And I would love to help a few more of the listeners of this podcast out. So if you were interested in it and you want to learn a little bit more, basically you can go to our website at summitstrength.com.au/online. And we got a nice video there which kind of just talks through what it's all about, what's involved in this and that. And if you are interested in just hearing a bit more, you can basically book a call with our team, and we can sort of have a chat and dive into things. So for anyone who was looking for a little bit extra help, who was interested in sort of finding out what we do and seeing if and how one of our programs may be a good fit for you, feel free, go to our website at summitstrength.com.au/online, and you can check it all out from there. So that's everything I've got to say for today. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Hope you have a lovely day, and we'll talk to you very soon. Bye.